Evelyn Carter had buried her husband with one hand and held a pie tin with the other, because baking was the only thing left that didn't make her cry. She walked across that sun-scorched Georgia field with flour on her apron and grief in her chest, telling herself it was just neighborly, just kindness, just pie. She never expected the man who turned around to be the same handwriting she'd fallen in love with for 8 months. If this story moves you, hit subscribe. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Evelyn Carter decided to bring pie to her new neighbor was the same morning she found her late husband's pocket watch in the bottom of the flour tin. She didn't know how it got there. Thomas had been gone 11 months, and she had gone through every drawer, every coat pocket, every corner of that farmhouse, with the particular madness of a woman trying to hold grief at arm's length by staying busy. But there it was, small and gold and ticking, as though it had never stopped, as though Thomas himself had dropped it in there, just to remind her that even in the middle of ordinary mornings, sorrow had a way of ambushing a person. She stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment. The summer heat was already pressing through the windows. Outside, cicadas were screaming in the oak trees. Somewhere down the road, a horse nickered. Life kept going. It always kept going, and some days that felt like mercy, and some days it felt like an insult. Evelyn set the watch on the windowsill. Then she went back to rolling her pie crust. She had already decided on apple. The filling was cooling in the pot cinnamon and brown sugar and sliced fruit, and the smell of it was one of the few things left in the world that felt like home. She'd told herself it was good manners the Callaway place had been empty for 3 years, and whoever had moved in 2 weeks ago hadn't come into town yet, hadn't introduced himself, hadn't done a single thing that small-town Sweetwater Ridge expected of a new arrival. People were already talking. Probably some kind of drifter. Margaret Howell had said at the post office loud enough for 3 other women to hear. Or worse, a man who comes to a place like this and doesn't say a word to his neighbors. There's a reason for that kind of quiet. Evelyn had smiled politely and said nothing. She had learned in the 11 months since Thomas died that the easiest way to survive Sweetwater Ridge was to speak as little as possible and bake as often as her hands could manage. She rolled the crust, pressed it into the tin, crimped the edges the way her mother had taught her. She worked slowly. There was no reason to hurry anymore. Hurrying had belonged to a different life, the one where Thomas came home for supper at 6, and the house had 2 voices in it. She slid the pie into the oven and went to sit on the porch steps while it baked. That was when she saw him. He was working the far fence line on the Callaway property shirtless in the Georgia heat, driving posts into the summer-hard ground, with a mallet that he swung like it cost him nothing. Even from that distance, she could see the efficiency of it, no wasted motion, no hesitation. A man who knew how to work. A man who had been working hard his whole life. Evelyn told herself she was not staring. She was simply sitting on her porch, in her own yard, looking at the sky, which happened to have a man in it. She went back inside when the timer rang. Dead. The pie was still warm when she wrapped it in a dish towel and walked across the field. She had changed her apron for a clean one and brushed the flour out of her hair, and she told herself that was just basic dignity and not anything else. The grass was tall and dry between the 2 properties, and it caught at the hem of her dress as she walked. The afternoon sun was brutal, the kind of July heat that turned the air thick and made every step feel earned. She was rehearsing what she would say. "Hello, I'm Evelyn Carter. I live next door. Welcome to Sweetwater Ridge." Simple, neighborly. She would hand him the pie and walk back home, and that would be the end of it. She was 15 feet away when he turned around, and Evelyn Carter's feet stopped working. She had spent 8 months writing letters to a man she had never met. It had started as foolishness. Her friend Ruth's idea, the Pen Pal program for rural Georgia, a way to pass the long winter evenings after Thomas died. She had almost thrown the address away 4 times. But loneliness has a way of wearing a person down, and one February night, she had sat down and written a letter, and 3 weeks later, an answer had come back, and it had been so honest and so plain-spoken and so unexpectedly kind that she had cried over it like a woman half her age. His name in those letters was simply J. Callaway. The man standing in front of her, sweat-damp and dark-haired, and watching her with careful brown eyes, was holding a mallet in one hand and looking at her like he was trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't expected to encounter. The pie slipped. She grabbed for it. He moved at the same moment, and the tin caught between them at a bad angle, and the whole thing tilted, and the apple filling surged up and over the crust and poured directly onto Evelyn's apron in a slow, dignified, catastrophic wave. She stood there. He stood there. The cicadas screamed on. "Ma'am," he said finally. His voice was low and careful, the kind of voice that had learned to move slow in order to keep from startling things. "You all right? I brought you a pie," she said. Her voice came out entirely calm, which she would later consider one of the great achievements of her life. "I'm afraid it's had a change of plans." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but close. "Jesse Calloway," he said. "Evelyn Carter." She looked down at the ruined apron. "I apologize. I'm usually better at this. I suspect the heat's to blame." He looked at the mess with the same unhurried assessment he'd been giving the fence posts. "Let me get you something to clean up with." "That's not necessary." "It is." He said it simply without argument and turned toward the house. She followed because she didn't know what else to do. His kitchen was spare and clean in the way of a man who had learned to keep only what he needed. There was a coffee pot on the stove, a few tin cups, a table with 2 chairs. He brought her a damp cloth and poured water into a bowl without being asked, and he did it quietly, the way people do when they've spent enough time alone that they've learned not to fill silence with unnecessary noise. "You just moved in," she said, working at the apron. 2 weeks back. People in town have been wondering about you." He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if she wanted any and set one in front of her. "I figured they might be." "You haven't come in yet." "No." She looked at him across the table. In the letters, she had imagined a voice, but not a face. She had imagined kindness, and she had been right about that. She had not imagined the particular quality of his stillness, the way he occupied his own silence like it was something he'd earned. "You've been receiving letters," she said. The words came out before she could weigh them properly. "At this address. From the Pen Pal program." He went very still. She watched him put it together. She watched the moment it landed. "Evelyn," he said. Not a question. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something moving behind his eyes that she couldn't name yet, recognition maybe, or something rawer than that. Something that looked a little like relief. "I wrote you back," he said carefully. "Things I haven't said to another person in a long time." "I know." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "So did I." She went home before dark. She left without the apron he offered to launder it, and she accepted because she couldn't think of a good reason to say no and because part of her wanted the excuse to come back. She sat on her porch that night and looked at the lights in the Calloway house windows and tried to sort through what she was feeling. It was a complicated sorting. There was joy in it, the kind she'd forgotten was still available to her. And there was terror, the particular terror of someone who has already loved one person all the way to the end and knows exactly what that costs. Thomas had been a good man. A quiet man like Jesse, actually. She had loved him for 22 years. She still loved him in the way you love things that have become part of the structure of who you are, not separate from yourself, but woven through like old timber in a house. She would not stop loving Thomas because a stranger had brown eyes and a careful voice and had written her things about loneliness and morning light that she had read and reread through the worst winter of her life. But she was 38 years old, and there were still a long many mornings ahead of her. She went inside and wrote him a letter. She wrote it the way she always had, honest, plain spoken, without prettying it up. She told him she had not expected this. She told him it was frightening. She told him that the pie had been apple, which she thought he deserved to know. She slipped it under his door that same night in the dark, before she could think better of it. He was on her porch the next morning before she'd finished her coffee. She opened the door, and he held up the letter she'd written and said, I walked all the way to town this morning to send you one of these. Then I found yours." "What did yours say?" He handed it to her instead of answering. She unfolded it on the doorstep while he stood there hat in hand, and she read it slowly. He had written that he had moved to Sweetwater Ridge deliberately, that he had asked about the address, that he had told himself he wasn't going to knock on her door until he'd thought about it properly, because a man who'd been alone as long as he had didn't have the right to rush at a thing. He had written, "I have been careful my whole life. I am not certain I want to be careful about this." Evelyn read that line twice. Then she stepped back from the door. "Coffee's still hot," she said. "You'd better come in." It was not simple. Nothing of value ever is. Sweetwater Ridge was a town that had a long memory and a short leash on what it considered acceptable. A widow socializing with a man who was not her husband, not even a full year out of mourning. The talk started before the coffee cups were washed. She heard it at the general store, heard it through Margaret Howell's particular brand of concern that wrapped judgment in the language of worry. "I'm only saying, Evelyn, people notice things. And you being such a large woman, you don't want them thinking you're desperate." Evelyn set down her basket and looked at Margaret with the same steadiness she'd used for the ruined pie. "Margaret," she said quietly, "I will let you know when I'm interested in your opinion of my body. Don't hold your breath waiting." She picked up her basket and walked to the counter and did not look back. She told Jesse about it that evening. They had fallen into the habit of porch evenings, his porch or hers coffee or lemonade, the slow unwinding of a day. It felt both dangerously new and impossibly old, the way some things do when they arrive in a shape that fits too well to be coincidence. "She said that to you," he said. "It came out flat." "She did." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did you say back?" She told him. He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been admiration. "Good," he said. It was the right answer. She hadn't needed him to be outraged on her behalf. She'd needed him to trust her to handle her own battles, and he did, and that mattered more than she could have explained. But the talk kept going, and 3 days later, Caroline Winters arrived at Evelyn's front door. She was Jesse's sister-in-law, his late brother Daniel's wife, a tall, sharp-boned woman with smooth blonde hair and the kind of smile that was assembled rather than felt. She arrived in a good carriage and stood on Evelyn's porch like she was doing Evelyn the honor of a visit. "I heard about you and Jesse," Caroline said, skipping the pleasantries. "I thought we should speak plainly." "All right," Evelyn said. She did not invite her in. "Jesse is not what he appears." Caroline tilted her head like she was delivering facts instead of poison. "He has a history of instability. After Daniel died, he disappeared for 2 years. No one knew where he was. There were debts, Mrs. Carter. There was conduct that this town would find very troubling if it came to light." Evelyn studied her. "What do you want, Miss Winters?" Something flickered behind Caroline's careful eyes. "I want you to know what you're getting into. And if I told you I already know exactly who Jesse Calloway is..." Caroline smiled. "You know what he's written in letters, Mrs. Carter? That's not the same thing." She left before Evelyn could answer. She left the words sitting on the porch like something that needed to be stepped over. Evelyn stood there until the carriage had gone. Then she walked across the field to Jesse's fence line, and she stood there until he looked up. "Your sister-in-law paid me a visit," she said. He set down his mallet. His jaw tightened. "What did she say?" "A great many things. I'd like to hear your answer to them." He nodded once. "Then come sit down," he said, "and I'll tell you all of it." She followed him to the porch. She sat down. And Jesse Calloway, who had been careful his whole life, told her the truth about Daniel, about the debts that had been Daniel's, and not his, about the 2 years he'd spent working off money he hadn't owed, about why he'd come to Sweetwater Ridge with nothing but a horse and a will to start over. When he finished, the summer evening had gone purple and soft around them. "She's not done," Evelyn said. "No," Jesse agreed. "She isn't. Then neither are we." He looked at her in the half-dark. For the first time he let her see something that had been sitting behind all that careful stillness. Something tired and hopeful, and a little afraid. "No," he said. "I don't reckon we are." Caroline Winters did not believe in wasting time. By the following Sunday, every pew in Sweetwater Ridge Baptist Church knew her version of Jesse Calloway's story. Evelyn heard it the moment she walked through the doors. Not shouted, not announced, but whispered in that careful, deliberate way that is somehow louder than shouting. She caught fragments. Debts. Disappeared. No one really knows where he came from. She watched heads turn toward her, and then quickly away the way people look at something they find both interesting and shameful. She took her usual seat, third row from the front left side, the same seat she had occupied for 22 years beside Thomas. She sat alone in it now. She folded her hands in her lap and stared at the pulpit and breathed slowly, and she did not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her flinch. Jesse had not come to church. She had not asked him to. They were not at the stage of things where she could ask that of a man. And besides, she suspected Sweetwater Ridge Baptist was about the last place on earth Jesse Calloway wanted to be on a Sunday morning. She couldn't say she blamed him. After the service, Margaret Howell appeared at her elbow like she'd been conjured. "Evelyn?" Her voice was soft with performed concern. "I hope you're being careful." "I'm always careful, Margaret." Caroline Winters spoke to Reverend Aldous last week, privately. Margaret leaned in slightly. "She's worried about Jesse's influence on this community. She said he has a violent past." Evelyn turned and looked at her fully. "Did she provide any evidence of that?" Margaret blinked. "Well," she said, "evidence, Margaret, not what she said, what she proved." The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. Evelyn nodded once, excused herself, and walked out of the churchyard before her hands could start shaking. She was halfway home when she heard boots on the road behind her. She turned. Jesse was there, coming from the direction of the feed store, a paper sack under one arm. He slowed when he saw her face. "What happened?" he asked. "Caroline spoke to the Reverend," she said. "She's telling people you have a violent past." He didn't move. Something went very quiet in his expression, the particular quiet of a man absorbing a blow he had been expecting. "Jesse." She stepped closer. "Is there anything she can use?" "Anything true." He met her eyes. "I got in a fight once, 7 years ago. Man owed Daniel money and came to collect it rough. I put him on the ground and he left." A pause. "He pressed charges. They were dropped." "Dropped because 3 witnesses said he threw the first punch, which he did." His jaw worked. "But records exist, Evelyn, and a woman like Caroline knows how to find them, and how to tell them wrong." She thought about that for a moment. The heat pressed down around them. Someone down the street had come out onto their porch and was watching with no pretense of subtlety. "Then we need to find them first," she said, "and tell them right." She went to see Sarah Chen the next morning. Sarah ran the only law office in Sweetwater Ridge out of a narrow building between the barber and the dry goods store, and she was the only female attorney within 40 miles, which meant half the town pretended she didn't exist, and the other half came to her in secret when they needed something done properly. Evelyn had met her twice. She liked her both times. Sarah listened without interrupting. She had that quality, a kind of complete focused attention that made you feel like every word was being weighed seriously. When Evelyn finished, Sarah set down her pen. "The court record is public," she said. "Charges filed, charges dropped. Anyone can read it, but most people won't go looking unless someone points them to it. Caroline will point them to it." "Yes." Sarah tapped the desk. "The question is what she's actually after. Because spreading gossip is unpleasant, but it isn't illegal. If she makes a specific false claim in writing in front of witnesses to someone in a position of authority, that's different." She spoke to the Reverend. "Reverends don't have legal authority." Sarah picked up her pen again. "I need you to write down everything she said to you, word for word, as close as you can remember. And I need Jesse to do the same. Can you get him to come in?" "Yes," Evelyn said without hesitating. She said it with a certainty that surprised her slightly on the walk home. Yes. Not I'll ask him or I think so. Just yes, the way you answer questions about people you have decided to trust. Jesse came to Sarah's office the next afternoon. Evelyn sat beside him and watched him answer Sarah's questions with the same steady plainness he brought to everything. Not defensive, not elaborating, more than asked, just honest in that quiet, bone-deep way of his that made her feel every time she witnessed it, like something in her chest was being carefully rearranged. He had the letters from the court. He'd kept them folded small in the back of a saddlebag, not because he thought he'd need them, but because a man who has been wrongly accused once learns not to throw away his proof. Sarah read them, made notes, handed them back. She can't use this against you legally, Sarah said, but she can use it socially, and in a town this size, that's nearly the same thing. She looked at Jesse. Do you know why she's doing this? Daniel left me the Calloway property, Jesse said, in his will. Caroline contested it and lost. She's been contesting it for 3 years. Sarah's expression sharpened. So this isn't about your character? No, it's about the land. The room went quiet for a moment. Evelyn looked at Jesse. He was looking at the desk. She wants the property, Evelyn said slowly. She wants to sell it. There's a railroad company interested in this stretch of Georgia. Daniel knew about it before he died. He wanted the land kept. Jesse's voice was flat and careful. He left it to me because he knew I'd keep it. And Caroline, Sarah said, is trying to run you out of town before the railroad makes its offer formal. That'd be my guess. Sarah Chen set down her pen with the quiet click of someone who had just made a decision. All right, she said. Here's what we're going to do. Yand. It should have felt manageable. Sarah had a plan. Jesse had his papers. Evelyn had her stubbornness, which had always been her most reliable resource. It should have felt like the beginning of a solution. Then Thursday happened. Evelyn was at the general store when she overheard it. Not a whisper this time, but an actual conversation conducted at full volume by Caroline Winters and Dora Hatch, the wife of the county commissioner, standing in the middle of the dry goods aisle like they owned the air around them. A woman her size, Caroline was saying with a sympathy so elaborate it turned her stomach. Running after a drifter like that, it's sad, really. You have to wonder if she even sees herself clearly. Dora made a sound of agreement. Thomas Carter was such a respectable man. He'd be mortified. She's lonely. It makes people foolish. I just hope Jesse doesn't take advantage of that. Evelyn stood at the end of the aisle with a tin of coffee in her hand. She had a choice in that moment. She was aware of making it. She could walk away, could slip out the side door, go home, write a letter to Sarah. Let the legal machinery handle it. That was the sensible thing. That was the thing a woman who wanted to avoid trouble would do. She walked forward instead. Caroline, she said loud enough to carry to the 3 other people in the store. Caroline turned. Something moved across her face, surprise, then calculation, then the smile. Evelyn, I heard what you were just doing. Evelyn set the coffee tin on the nearest shelf with a careful thump and looked at Dora Hatch. Mrs. Hatch, do you have any idea what Jesse Calloway actually did to warrant the story this woman has been selling around town? Dora looked uncomfortable. Well, Caroline said... What Caroline said? Evelyn spoke over her, not loudly, but with a precision that left no room for interruption. Is that a man who legally defended himself against an assault has a violent past. That's not a description of his character. That's a description of her intentions. She turned back to Caroline. You want his land. Say that plainly if you're going to say anything. Don't dress it up in concern for my loneliness. Caroline's smile did not move, but something behind it did. You're making a scene, she said softly. I'm stating facts. There's a difference. Evelyn picked up her coffee tin. I hope your conversation with the railroad company goes poorly, Miss Winters. Good afternoon. She paid at the counter. She walked out. She made it all the way to the far end of the street before her hands started shaking. She sat down on the bench outside the post office and breathed. A minute later, footsteps. She looked up. It was old Harold Pruitt who ran the post office and had known her since she was a child and said very little about anything ever. "Heard that from the doorway," he said, settling onto the other end of the bench. "I imagine half the town did. Most of them been wanting to say something like that to Caroline Winters for about 3 years. He pulled out his pipe. "You want me to spread that around, or you want to handle your own business?" Evelyn looked at him. "What do you know about the railroad offer?" Harold puffed his pipe. "I know the agent's been in town twice. I know he sent a letter to Jesse's address last month." A pause. "And I know Caroline had a copy of that letter sitting on her parlor table when I delivered it." Evelyn went still. "She intercepted his mail." "I didn't say that. I said she had a copy." Another puff. "Wouldn't be the first time a man in this town looked the other way for a woman with money. Postal Service runs on human beings, Evelyn. Human beings have failings." She sat with that for a moment. The implications of it were large and ugly. "Harold," she said, "would you write down what you just told me?" He looked at her sideways. "You going to take it to Sarah Chen?" "Yes." He thought about it. "You know I'll catch grief for it." "I know." He nodded slowly. "Come by tomorrow morning, before the mail runs." She told Jesse that evening. He was quiet while she talked the way he was when something mattered enough to deserve the full weight of his attention. She told him about the store, about Caroline's words about Dora Hatch's face when she'd been called to account. She told him about Harold and the letter. When she finished, he said, "Evelyn, you shouldn't have confronted her alone." "I didn't plan it." "I know, but Caroline she's not a woman who accepts losing gracefully. If you've drawn her attention directly, she'll come back harder." "Then she'll come back to 2 of us," Evelyn said. "Not 1. He looked at her across the small kitchen table in the late evening light. She had come to think of these moments, his kitchen, her porch, the particular quality of the air between them, as something she was building toward one careful stone at a time. "You're not frightened," he said. "I'm terrified," she corrected. "I just don't let terrified make my decisions." Something shifted in his face. It happened sometimes, a crack in the careful stillness, a glimpse of something beneath it. He looked like a man who had been braced for disappointment so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be surprised by something good. "I've been alone a long time," he said quietly. "Before I started writing those letters, I had gone 2 winters without a real conversation. You understand what I mean? Not talk, a real conversation, where somebody actually hears you." She understood. She understood exactly. "The letters," she said. "When you first wrote back to me, what made you answer?" He was quiet for a moment. "You said in your first letter that you didn't know what to write, but that the quiet in the house was so loud it was making you crazy, and writing anything seemed better than sitting with it." He looked at his hands. "I'd been sitting with that same quiet for 2 years. I figured anyone who described it that way was worth talking to." She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. "I looked up the address," he said. "After the 3rd letter. I wanted to know the place. Then I started thinking about the land here and the railroad and needing somewhere to be, and I thought, well, might as well be somewhere I already know one person." She laughed. It came out surprised and genuine, and she felt it all through her chest. "You moved next door to a pen pal, and I moved next door to the only person who'd made sense to me in 2 years." He wasn't smiling exactly. Wasn't a hard decision. She sat with that. It was the most romantic thing she had ever been told, and it had been delivered with the practicality of a man discussing fence posts. She found that she loved that about him, the way his honesty had no decoration on it. "Jesse," she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her. I haven't let myself think about the future. Not since Thomas. It felt like something I didn't have the right to anymore." She turned her coffee cup between her hands. "But I think about it now. When I'm here, I think about it, and it doesn't feel wrong." He was very still. "I don't know what that means yet," she said. "I'm not rushing at anything. but I wanted you to know it." He nodded. Once, slowly. Like a man receiving something precious and making sure he didn't drop it. "I've written you letters for 8 months," he said, "about things I haven't said to another person in years. I reckon that's already something." "It is," she said. "It's quite a lot, actually." Sarah Chen's letter arrived the next morning, forwarded through Harold's post office with unusual speed. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table and then read it again. Caroline Winters had filed a formal complaint with the county commissioner's office. She was claiming that Jesse Calloway had obtained the property through undue influence over his dying brother, in effect, that he had manipulated Daniel in his final months to secure the inheritance over Caroline's objections. It was not a criminal charge. But it was a formal allegation, which meant there would be a hearing, which meant the railroad deal would be frozen until the question was settled. And a hearing in Sweetwater Ridge meant the whole town would know by nightfall. Evelyn put the letter down and looked at the pocket watch she'd moved from the windowsill to the table. Thomas's watch ticking in the summer quiet. She thought about what Jesse had said. "I have been careful my whole life." She thought about what she had said in return. "I'm terrified. I just don't let terrified make my decisions." She picked up the letter. She folded it. She put on her good walking shoes. She was across the field and knocking on Jesse's door before the coffee had finished cooling in her cup. He opened it. She handed him the letter. He read it. His face didn't change the way most people's would, no color draining, no jaw-dropping. Just that quiet settling into something harder, something that had made its decision. "When's the hearing?" he asked. "Sarah says 3 weeks. He looked at the letter one more moment. Then he looked at her. "I'm not leaving," he said. Not to her, not to anyone in particular. Just out loud, the way a man states a fact he intends to make true. "No," she agreed. "You're not. You don't have to be part of this, Evelyn. Caroline's going to make it ugly. She's going to put your name in it." "My name," Evelyn said steadily, "is already in it. She put it there when she stood in the dry goods aisle and talked about my loneliness." She met his eyes. "I'm not stepping back, Jesse. I've been stepping back for 11 months. I'm through with it." He looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, the morning was pressing through the windows, summer bright and relentless. "All right," he said at last. "All right," she said. That afternoon, they sat at Sarah Chen's desk together for the first time and began building their case. Harold Pruitt came by at 4 o'clock with a written statement in his hand and the expression of a man who had decided late in life that doing the right thing was worth the trouble. Jesse spread his court documents across the table. All of them, every piece of paper he had carried in that saddlebag for 7 years. Sarah read everything. She made her notes. She looked up. "She's overreached," Sarah said. The complaint about undue influence, she'd have to prove Jesse was present and manipulative during the final changes to Daniel's will. "I've already requested the will documents and the attending physician's statements." She looked at Jesse. "Were you even in Georgia when Daniel died?" "No," Jesse said. "I was in Tennessee. I have a letter from Daniel sent to me there dated 2 weeks before he passed, telling me what he'd decided." He reached into the saddlebag and produced it, old, folded, clearly handled many times. "He wrote that Caroline would fight it. He told me to hold on to this." Sarah took the letter with the careful hands of someone recognizing evidence. "Your brother knew," she said. "Daniel knew his wife," Jesse said simply. Sarah nodded. "Then we'll be ready," she said. "But 3 weeks is not a long time, and Caroline has money and spite on her side. She will not make this easy." She did not. The next morning there was a notice pinned to the board outside the post office. Not an official document, just a printed sheet, the kind that anyone with access to a press could produce. It quoted the formal complaint in full. It named Jesse. It named the property. It also mentioned in 2 pointed sentences at the bottom that a local widow had been seen visiting the property repeatedly, and that the community might wish to consider what exactly was being cultivated there. Evelyn read it, looked at it for a long moment, unpinned it from the board, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. Then she walked to the Reverend's door and knocked. Reverend Aldous answered. He was a soft-faced man who tried to be fair and occasionally managed it. "Evelyn," he said with the particular look of a man who is not happy about the position he's in. "Reverend." She held up the notice. This was on the public board. It is not a legal document, it is not a community announcement, and it involves private citizens who have not committed any wrong. I'm asking you as a man of God in this community to say so publicly. He was quiet. "She spoke to you about Jesse," Evelyn said. "I know that. I'm asking what you believe, not what you've been told." Another silence. Longer. "I don't believe Jesse Calloway means this town harm," he said finally. "Then say so. From the pulpit. Not a sermon, just a word. That a man is innocent until proven otherwise, and that this community does not treat allegations as verdicts." She looked at him steadily. "That's all I'm asking. Fairness. I thought that was the business you were in." He looked at the notice in her hand. He looked at her. "Sunday," he said. "Thank you," she said, and turned and walked home with her spine straight and her hands perfectly steady and the notice crumpled in her fist. She got back to the house and sat down hard in the kitchen chair and shook for about 3 minutes. Then she got up, put the kettle on, and wrote Sarah Chen a letter detailing everything that had happened since breakfast. She sealed it, stamped it, and walked it back to Harold's post office herself. On the way, she passed Jesse at the fence line. He was back at work posts, mallet the same unhurried motion as the day she'd first seen him. He looked up when she passed. She held up the sealed letter. "Sarah," she called. He nodded, went back to work. It was such a small thing. Such an ordinary moment, a woman walking to the post office, a man fixing a fence, summer heat pressing down on a Georgia morning. But Evelyn Carter walked with her chin up and her shoulders back, and she thought Thomas would have liked him. And for the first time that thought didn't hurt. It felt quietly and unexpectedly like permission. Reverend Aldous kept his word. Sunday morning before the first hymn, he stood at the pulpit and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the church that this community had a tradition of fairness, and that fairness meant a man was not guilty because someone said he was, and that he expected his congregation to remember that in the days ahead. He said it plainly without drama and sat back down. It lasted about 45 seconds. It was enough. Evelyn felt the shift in the room. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind you could point to, but the kind you feel in the quality of the silence. 2 women in the row ahead of her exchanged a look. Old Harold Pruitt, sitting in the back where he always sat, gave a single nod at no one in particular. Margaret Howell, 3 pews to the right, stared at her hymnal with an expression that suggested she was doing significant internal arithmetic. Caroline Winters was not in church that morning. Her absence was noticed. In Sweetwater Ridge, absence was always noticed. After the service, Evelyn was stopped on the steps by Dora Hatch. "I owe you an apology," Dora said. She said it quietly, like it cost her something which Evelyn respected. "What I said in the store about Thomas being mortified, that was unkind, and it wasn't my place." "No," Evelyn agreed. "It wasn't." Dora flinched slightly. She had probably expected more grace. The automatic forgiveness that women like Evelyn were supposed to offer women like Dora as a matter of social lubricant. Evelyn was tired of social lubricant. "I appreciate you saying so," she added because she was not cruel. "I mean that." Dora nodded and moved away. Evelyn walked down the steps and across the churchyard and thought about how strange it was, the mechanics of a small town shifting. How slow it was, and how it happened anyway, one conversation at a time, one moment of honesty at a time, grinding forward like a wheel in deep mud. She was at the gate when Jesse fell into step beside her. She hadn't seen him come in. He must have slipped into the back near the end. He was in a clean shirt hat in hand, and he matched her pace without asking if she minded. "Aldous did it," she said. "I heard." "Were you there? Long enough?" A pause. "Dora Hatch stopped you. She apologized. How'd you take it? Honestly." She glanced at him. I'm running low on polite fictions, Jesse. I've been handing them out all year, and I'm nearly empty. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Good. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, and Evelyn thought about how remarkable that was, the comfortable silence part. She had not had comfortable silence with another person since Thomas. She had had awkward silence, and grief-heavy silence, and the particular terrible silence of a house where someone used to be. This was different. This was the silence of two people who had run out of things they needed to perform for each other. Sarah wants us both in her office Tuesday, she said. She's received the physician's statements from Daniel's final weeks. Jesse's jaw tightened slightly. And she didn't say in the letter, just that we needed to come in. He nodded. She watched him absorb that, the not knowing, the waiting. He was good at waiting. She wondered sometimes how much of his life had been spent doing it. Whatever it says, she said, we handle it. Yes, he said, simply, like there was never any question. Tuesday came with the particular weight of days that matter. Sarah Chen had the physician's statements laid out across her desk when they arrived alongside Daniel Calloway's will, the letter Jesse had kept in his saddlebag, and 3 other documents that Evelyn didn't immediately recognize. Sarah waited until they were both seated before she spoke. The physician who attended Daniel in his final weeks was a Dr. Marcus Webb, Sarah said. He's retired now, living in Savannah. I wrote to him and he wrote back. She held up a letter. He states clearly that Daniel Calloway was of sound mind until 48 hours before his death. He also states that to his knowledge, Jesse Calloway was not present at any point during his patient's final month. She set the letter down. That directly contradicts the premise of Caroline's complaint. Jesse let out a slow breath. There's more, Sarah said. The will itself, I had it examined by a colleague who specializes in estate documents. The changes Daniel made removing Caroline as primary beneficiary and naming Jesse were made 14 months before his death. Not in his final weeks. Not when he was vulnerable. She looked at Jesse. Caroline has been claiming he manipulated a dying man. The timeline makes that impossible. The room was quiet. She knew this, Evelyn said. Yes, Sarah said. She knew the timeline. She made the complaint anyway because she needed the hearing to freeze the railroad negotiation, not because she expected to win. Sarah's voice was calm, but her eyes were not. She was buying time. Time for what? Jesse asked. Sarah picked up one of the documents Evelyn hadn't recognized. This arrived yesterday, from a law office in Atlanta. It appears that Caroline Winters has already entered into a preliminary agreement with the railroad company contingent on her establishing legal claim to the property within 60 days. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. This one had teeth. She's already sold it, Jesse said. His voice was flat. Not yet, contingent, but she's close. Sarah put the document down. If the hearing rules against you even preliminarily, she can move to have the property placed in disputed receivership while the full case works through the courts. That could take years. The railroad won't wait years. They'll complete the deal with whoever has clear title. Jesse stood up. He didn't pace. He just stood like he needed to put his feet under him. Evelyn watched him. She planned this from the moment I moved in, he said. Probably from the moment Daniel's will was settled and she lost the contest, Sarah said. She's had 3 years to prepare Jesse. We have 3 weeks. What do we do? Evelyn asked. Sarah looked at her. We file a countercomplaint. Fraudulent misrepresentation in a legal proceeding, she made statements she knew were false. We attach Dr. Webb's letter, the will examination, the original court documents from Tennessee. She paused. And we need Harold Pruitt's statement about the letter she shouldn't have had a copy of. He said he'd give it, Evelyn said. I need it in writing, signed, notarized, and in my hands by Friday. I'll have it Thursday, Evelyn said. Sarah looked at her steadily. Evelyn, if you push this, Caroline will push back. Directly at you. Not just gossip, she'll make claims about your character, your relationship with Jesse, your judgment. She'll do it publicly, and she'll do it in the hearing, if she can manage it. Evelyn looked back at her. I know. I want to make sure you, Sarah, she kept her voice even. I've been a widow in a small town for 11 months. My character has been discussed in this community every week since Thomas died. Caroline Winters does not have access to anything about my life that this town hasn't already chewed on and spit out. She straightened in the chair. Let her try. Sarah Chen, who was not easily impressed, looked at her for a moment with something that might have been admiration. Then she nodded once and picked up her pen.
Dr. Tian.
Harold's statement was ready by Wednesday afternoon. He had written it out in his careful post office hand, taken it to the notary in the next town over because he didn't trust anyone in Sweetwater Ridge with it yet, and brought it to Evelyn's door himself. She made him coffee. He sat at her kitchen table and looked at Thomas's pocket watch on the shelf. Knew Thomas since he was 20, Harold said. Good man. Yes, she agreed. He'd have liked the way you've handled this business. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He wasn't a man who liked things left crooked. She looked at the watch for a moment. No, he wasn't. Harold left. She sat with the statement in her hands and felt the strange doubled quality of grief and forward motion existing in the same moment. The way you could miss someone and still be fully alive, still be building something new, still be in the middle of a fight worth winning. She put the statement in her coat pocket and went to find Jesse. He was at the fence line. He always came back to the fence line when things were difficult. She had started to understand that about him, the way physical work was, how he processed things he couldn't control. She stood nearby and waited until he drove the last post of the section and straightened. Harold came through, she said, holding up the envelope. Something in his shoulders released. Good man. He said Thomas would have liked how I handled things. Jesse looked at her. Something moved across his face, careful and warm and a little painful, the way things are when they matter too much to be comfortable. He would have, Jesse said. I reckon I'm fairly sure of that. She put the envelope back in her pocket. How are you holding up? I'm all right. Jesse. He looked at her again differently this time. He knew by now that when she said his name like that, she was asking for the real answer. He set the mallet down. I built a life in Tennessee, he said. Slow and hard over 2 years. Had a small place, some horses work I was proud of. I left all of it because Daniel asked me to, because he wanted someone he trusted on this land. He looked out at the property, the house, the fence lines, the fields that had started coming back under his hands. I'm not leaving it to Caroline. Not because it's mine, because it was what Daniel wanted. And she's been trying to take that from him since before he was cold in the ground. He stopped. His jaw worked once. And, he said quieter, because I'm done starting over. I've started over enough times. He looked at her directly. I want to stay. She held his gaze. Then we make sure you can. The counter-complaint landed in the county commissioner's office on Thursday morning, filed by Sarah Chen, with every supporting document attached. By Thursday afternoon, the whole of Sweetwater Ridge knew about it, because that was the nature of Sweetwater Ridge. By Thursday evening, Caroline Winters was at Evelyn's door. Evelyn opened it and did not invite her in. She stood in the doorway and waited. Caroline had lost some of her careful composure. It was subtle a tightness around the eyes, a fraction too much deliberateness in her posture. She was a woman who had always been the one applying pressure, and the experience of having it applied back was new to her. You filed against me, she said. Sarah Chen filed on Jesse's behalf, Evelyn said. I provided a statement. You are making an enormous mistake. I've made mistakes, Evelyn said. This isn't one of them. I have resources you can't match. I have connections in Atlanta. I can make this very difficult for Jesse and for you. She said it without heat, which was somehow worse than anger. I'm offering you a chance to step back from this, Evelyn. Walk away. Let the legal process work. The legal process is working, Evelyn said. That's what you're unhappy about. Caroline's eyes went cold. Jesse Calloway is using you. A lonely widow with a soft heart, you're convenient to him. You give him credibility in this community. Evelyn felt the words try to land, felt herself weigh them honestly, the way she weighed everything. She had asked herself the same question in darker moments alone in the farmhouse. She had examined it from every angle she could think of. "You might be right," she said steadily. "People have been wrong about people they trusted. It happens." She kept her eyes on Caroline. "But I have read that man's letters for 8 months. I have sat at his table and watched him tell the truth when lying would have been easier. I have seen him handle unfair treatment with more dignity than most people manage when everything is going fine." She tilted her head slightly. "What I have not seen is any evidence that he is what you're saying he is. And what I have seen plenty of is evidence of what you are." The silence between them had gone entirely still. "Good night, Caroline," Evelyn said and closed the door. She stood on her side of it for a moment. She could hear her own heartbeat. Then she went to the kitchen, sat down, and for the second time since Thomas died, she let herself cry. Not from grief this time, but from the particular exhaustion of standing your ground when everything in you is shaking. She allowed it for about 5 minutes. Then she washed her face and wrote Sarah a letter detailing the visit. The hearing date was set for a Tuesday, 3 weeks out, and the days between had a quality of compressed time. Everything moving fast and slow at once each morning, heavy with what was coming each evening spent in Sarah's office, or at Jesse's kitchen table, going over documents, statements, timelines. The town watched. That was what small towns did. They watched and they waited and they made their judgments before the verdict, and sometimes changed them after, and sometimes didn't. Evelyn felt the watching every time she went to the store, every time she walked to the post office, every Sunday in the pew. But something had shifted since the Reverend's words, since the counter-complaint, since the story of Caroline's visit to Evelyn's door had made its way through the community's particular telegraph system. She started to feel it in small things, a nod from a man at the hardware store she didn't know well, a jar of preserves left on her porch step, with no note. 2 women from the church circle who stopped to speak to her after service and said nothing about Jessie at all. Just asked how she was holding up, and meant it. A week before the hearing, Margaret Howell knocked on her door. Evelyn answered it with the same wariness she'd started answering all doors with. Margaret stood on the step, holding a covered dish. She looked uncomfortable in the specific way of people who are doing something their pride is fighting them on. "Beef stew," she said. "You've been busy. I thought I made extra." Evelyn looked at her. "I'm sorry," Margaret had said, "for what I said. About your size and being desperate." She held the dish out like it was a peace offering because it was. "It was unkind, and it wasn't true, and I've been ashamed of it." Evelyn took the dish. The weight of it was warm through the cloth. "Come in," she said. "Coffee's on." Margaret came in. They sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee, and did not talk about Jessie, or Caroline, or the hearing. Margaret talked about her garden, and Evelyn talked about Thomas's watch and what she had finally decided to do with it. It was, Evelyn thought afterward, the most human conversation she'd had with Margaret Howell in 20 years of knowing her. Small towns were maddening. They were also occasionally capable of something like grace. 4 days before the hearing, Sarah called them both in. "I received something this morning," she said, and her tone had a careful quality that put Evelyn on alert immediately. From Dr. Webb's attorney in Savannah. She held up a document. "Dr. Webb has agreed to appear at the hearing in person to give testimony." She paused. "He also sent a supplementary statement that arrived with his travel arrangements." She read it to them. In the months before Daniel Calloway's death, Caroline Winters had visited the physician twice. On both occasions, she had asked Dr. Webb whether Daniel's mental state could be characterized as compromised. On both occasions, he had told her it could not. On the second visit, she had offered him money to characterize it otherwise. He had declined. He had not reported it at the time. He was reporting it now. The room was quiet. "She tried to buy false medical testimony," Jessie said. 3 years ago, Sarah confirmed, before she even filed the original will contest. She set the statement down. She has been building this case, this entire edifice of lies, for 3 years. And Dr. Webb watched the hearing date approach and decided he'd carried that silence long enough. Jesse was looking at the table. Evelyn watched him process it. The scale of it, the years of it, the sheer sustained malice of a woman who had decided a piece of land was worth destroying a man's life for. "She'll have nothing left when this comes out," Evelyn said. "No." Sarah agreed. "But she'll try everything she has left before that happens." She looked at them both. "The hearing is Tuesday. I want you both there. I want you composed and present and ready for her to make it personal, because she will." "We'll be there," Jesse said. "Jesse." Sarah held his eyes. "She's going to talk about Daniel. She's going to try to make it painful. She knows this is where you're most exposed." Jesse was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was level. "Daniel deserves to have the truth told," he said. "Whatever it costs me to sit there and hear her lie about him, that's what I owe him." Sarah nodded. She looked at Evelyn. "And you?" she asked. "I'll be right beside him," Evelyn said. The Sunday before the hearing, Jesse showed up at Evelyn's door in the morning with a letter in his hand. Not from Sarah, not from a court. A personal letter written in his own handwriting on plain paper folded once. He handed it to her without explanation. She unfolded it. She read it standing in the doorway with the summer morning pressing in around them. He had written, "I have been trying to find the right way to say this, and there isn't one, so I'll just say it. Whatever happens Tuesday, I want you to know that the 8 months of letters and the weeks since, they are the best thing that has happened to me in longer than I can account for. I came to Sweetwater Ridge for Daniel's land, and I would fight for it again. But if I am honest, it is not the first thing I think about when I wake up anymore. I reckon you know what is. I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean. I'm also not a man who knows how to say them gracefully. I'm working on it. I'm working on." She stood there for the moment with the letter in her hands. The cicadas had started up already, though it was barely past 8. Heat rising. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that particular combination of courage and terror that she was starting to recognize as his version of vulnerability. A man who had learned to brace for the worst and was choosing against his better judgment to hope for something else. "Come in," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "Breakfast is almost ready." He came in. He took the same chair he always took. She put a plate in front of him and sat across from him, and they ate breakfast in the particular silence of two people who have just told each other something enormous and don't need to talk about it yet. When he left, he stopped in the doorway. "Tuesday," he said. "Tuesday," she confirmed. He nodded, put his hat on, walked back across the field in the summer morning, back toward the fence line and the house he had come to Sweetwater Ridge to keep. Evelyn stood in her doorway and watched him go. She had his letter in her apron pocket, pressed against her side. She thought, "Hold on, we're almost there." And then she went inside to get ready for what was coming. Tuesday arrived the way all important days do. Too fast and too slow. At once, the morning stretching out, and then suddenly gone. And then Evelyn was standing outside the county commissioner's building in the summer heat, with Jesse beside her and Sarah Chen 3 steps ahead. And there was nothing left to prepare. Sarah had said on this walk over, "Let me do the talking unless I ask you directly. Either of you, don't react to whatever she says. Don't look at her when she's speaking if you can help it." She had said it quietly and practically the way she said everything, and Evelyn had nodded, and Jesse had nodded, and now they were here. The building was small and too warm. A single long room with a raised platform at the front, where Commissioner Gerald Hatch sat with 2 deputies and a court recorder. Dora Hatch's husband. Evelyn had thought about that, had mentioned it to Sarah, who had noted it with the expression of someone filing it away. Caroline was already seated at the far table with her Atlanta attorney. A tall man in an expensive suit who looked at Sarah Chen with the particular condescension of a man who had underestimated the wrong woman before and learned nothing from it. The room had filled. That was the thing about Sweetwater Ridge. Any proceedings of consequence became a public event, whether they were meant to or not. Harold Pruitt was there in the third row, Reverend Aldous, Margaret Howell, a dozen others whose names Evelyn knew and whose opinions she'd felt on her skin for the past 3 weeks. Dr. Webb sat in the front row. He was 70 or close to it, white-haired and straight-backed, and when Jessie walked in, the old doctor looked at him with an expression that Evelyn could only describe as sorrow doing penance. Jessie saw him. His jaw tightened once, and then he sat down and looked forward. Commissioner Hatch called the proceeding to order. He read the complaint. He read the counter-complaint. His voice was flat and official and gave nothing away, though Evelyn watched his face when he read the part about Caroline and the railroad company, and something moved briefly behind his eyes. Caroline's attorney spoke first. He was smooth and deliberate, building his case the way a man does when he believes the other side has nothing, with a certain lazy confidence taking his time. He described Daniel Calloway's final months in language that made Jessie sound like a predator circling a dying man. He used words like vulnerable and isolated and undue pressure. He mentioned the fight in Tennessee, characterizing it in 3 sentences that turned self-defense into aggression. Evelyn kept her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at Caroline. Jessie did not move beside her. Sarah let it all land. She sat with her pen and her documents and her expression of polite, complete attention, and she let the attorney finish, and then she stood up. "Commissioner Hatch," she said, "I'd like to call Dr. Marcus Webb." Dr. Webb took the chair that had been placed at the front of the room and folded his hands in his lap, and looked at Sarah with the composure of a man who had decided something and was not going to be argued out of it. Sarah walked him through it methodically. His attendance of Daniel Calloway, the timeline of Daniel's mental and physical condition, the dates, the will changes made 14 months before death, the clarity of Daniel's mind in those final weeks. "In your professional assessment," Sarah said, "was Daniel Calloway of sound mind when he made his decision to name his brother as primary heir?" "Completely," Dr. Webb said. "There is no question in my mind." "Was Jesse Calloway present at any point during your care of Daniel Calloway in his final month?" "He was not." "Could Jesse Calloway have exercised undue influence over a man he was not physically present with in the final weeks of that man's life?" The Atlanta attorney objected. Commissioner Hatch sustained it, but the question had been heard and the room had heard it, and that was the point. Sarah moved on without missing a beat. "Dr. Webb, in the months before Daniel Calloway's death, did you receive any visits from Caroline Winters?" The room shifted. Caroline's attorney was on his feet. "Objection relevance." "I'll establish relevance immediately," Sarah said calmly. Hatch looked at the attorney, then at Sarah. "Proceed, Ms. Chen, briefly." "Dr. Webb," Sarah said, "did Caroline Winters on either of those 2 visits offer you financial compensation to characterize Daniel Calloway's mental state as compromised?" The silence in the room was absolute. Dr. Webb said she did. "And what did you say?" "I said no." He paused. "I should have reported it at the time. I didn't, and I've regretted it. I'm correcting that now." The Atlanta attorney was speaking rapidly to Commissioner Hatch. Evelyn did not look at Caroline, but she felt the energy at that table change, felt it the way you feel a shift in weather, a pressure change before a storm. "I move to have this testimony stricken," the attorney said. "It is not relevant to the complaint as filed." "It is directly relevant," Sarah said, "to the credibility of the complainant and the basis on which this proceeding was initiated." She turned to the commissioner. "If the complaint was filed by a woman who 3 years ago attempted to purchase false medical testimony, the integrity of every claim she has made in this proceeding is in question." Commissioner Hatch looked at Caroline's table. He was a careful man. Evelyn had always known that about him, careful in the way of men who valued their position, and she watched him calculate visibly what the safe direction was in a room full of witnesses. "We'll take a brief recess," he said. The recess lasted 20 minutes. Evelyn and Jessie stood in the hallway, and Jessie said nothing, and Evelyn said nothing. And Sarah came out of a side room with the expression of someone who had just had a conversation that went the way she needed it to. "She's offered to withdraw the complaint," Sarah said quietly. Jesse's head came up. "On what terms?" "No terms. Withdrawal. Her attorney just told me she wants to avoid Dr. Webb's testimony being entered into the formal record." Sarah's voice was level. "If it's entered, it becomes the basis for a separate criminal proceeding against her. She's trying to cut her losses." "What does withdrawal mean for the land?" Evelyn asked. "It means the complaint is gone. The property is uncontested. The railroad negotiation, if Jesse chooses to pursue it, is his to make." Sarah looked at him. "It means you win." Jesse stood very still for a moment. "She just walks away," he said. "I didn't say that." Sarah held his eyes. "I told her attorney that we would accept the withdrawal on one condition. She puts in writing signed and notarized that her complaint was without factual basis, and that she makes no further legal or public claim against you or your property." A pause. "And that the attempted suborning of Dr. Webb's testimony is disclosed to the appropriate authorities, which will happen whether she agrees or not, because Dr. Webb's statement is already in my files." The hallway was quiet. "She'll fight that last part," Jesse said. "She's already fighting it. Her attorney's on the telephone right now." Sarah checked her watch. "We go back in that room in 8 minutes, and if she hasn't agreed, Dr. Webb's testimony goes into the record, and we let the commissioner decide." She looked at Jesse. "Either way, you win. The question is whether you want the faster version or the version that takes another 6 months." Jesse looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him and said nothing because this was his to decide. He looked at the closed door of the hearing room. "She tried to buy a doctor's testimony. He said not to anyone in particular. About my dying brother." "Yes," Sarah said. "And if I take the withdrawal, she faces the disclosure, but she avoids having it read out in that room in front of everyone." "Correct." He was quiet for a moment. Evelyn watched him weigh at the hunger for full public exposure against the practical reality of what he'd come here for, what Daniel had asked of him, what actually needed to be protected. "Take the withdrawal," he said. "But I want that room to hear why before we close. I want Hatch to read Dr. Webb's statement into the record before the withdrawal is accepted." He looked at Sarah. "Can you do that?" Sarah Chen allowed herself a small, precise smile. "I already asked for it." Commissioner Hatch read Dr. Webb's full statement into the record before accepting the withdrawal. He read it in the same flat official voice he'd used for everything else, and the words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Caroline Winters. 2 visits, an offer of money, a refusal. Every word of it. Evelyn heard Margaret Howell make a soft sound 2 rows back. She heard someone else shift in their chair. She did not look at Caroline. When Hatch finished reading, he looked at the room over his glasses. "The complaint is withdrawn," he said. "The property at the Calloway address remains with its registered owner, Jesse Calloway, without contest. This proceeding is closed." He set down the papers. "Ms. Winters, you'll want to speak with your attorney about the disclosure matter. I'd suggest doing so promptly." Caroline stood. Evelyn finally looked at her. She was still composed. That was the thing, she was still assembled, still held together the way people are when they have so much practice controlling their surface that it holds even when everything underneath has collapsed. She walked out without looking at Jesse, and without looking at Evelyn, and her attorney followed her, and the door closed behind them. The room exhaled. Harold Pruitt started it just a single clap, slow and deliberate, from the 3rd row. Then Reverend Aldous. Then 3 others. It wasn't thunderous. It was the sound of people who had been watching a wrong thing and were relieved to see it set right. Jesse sat very still through all of it. Evelyn put her hand on the table next to his, not quite touching, just near, and felt him take a slow breath. "It's done," she said quietly. "It's done," he agreed. He sounded like a man who had put down something heavy after a very long time of carrying it. Dr. Webb found them outside afterward. He walked up to Jesse directly and stopped in front of him and said, "I owe you an apology. 3 years ago, I should have reported what she asked me to do. I didn't, and it let this go on longer than it should have." Jesse looked at the old man for a moment. "Why didn't you?" he asked. Not accusing, just asking. Dr. Webb was quiet for a moment. "She was a grieving widow," he said. "Or, I thought she was. I told myself she was acting from grief and that making trouble for a widow wouldn't serve anyone." He paused. "I was wrong. Grief doesn't license what she did. I should have known that." Jesse put his hand out. Dr. Webb shook it. "Thank you for coming," Jesse said. "For Daniel." The old man nodded. He walked away with the careful gait of someone who had set down his own weight. Sarah was already gone. A note pressed into Evelyn's hand as she left, reminding them of the paperwork to be completed, the disclosure process, the timeline. Sarah Chen did not stop working when battles were won. Evelyn respected that enormously. Margaret Howell stopped beside them on the front steps. "I want you both to know," she said with the clipped precision of a woman who has rehearsed something difficult, "that I intend to say publicly what I should have said 3 weeks ago. That Jesse Calloway came to this community honestly and has been treated unfairly." Jesse looked at her. "I appreciate that, ma'am." Margaret nodded. She looked at Evelyn. "You were right to stand by him." Something worked in her face. I hope things go well. For both of you." She walked away before Evelyn could answer. Jesse watched her go. "That was something," he said. "That was Margaret Howell admitting she was wrong," Evelyn said. "That's rarer than a February thaw." He made that almost laugh sound again, low and brief. They stood in the summer heat in front of the commissioner's building, and the town moved around them. People heading back to their days, nodding as they passed a few, stopping to say a word. Old Harold clapped Jesse on the shoulder and said nothing at all, which was somehow more than words. When the street had quieted, Jesse looked out at nothing in particular. "The railroad agent sent a letter," he said. "2 weeks ago. I haven't answered it." "What do you want to do?" "I want the land," he said. "I want to work it. I want to do what Daniel asked." He paused. "But there's a portion at the south end the corner that runs along the county road that I don't have a use for. Railroad could run through there without touching anything that matters." Evelyn looked at him. "You're going to negotiate with them?" "I reckon I should answer the letter first." Something moved in his expression. "I could use help with that." She smiled. "You know where to find me." He looked at her then fully the way he didn't always in public, the way he saved for porches in the evening and kitchen tables in the morning. The particular look of a man who is still slightly astonished by his own good fortune. "Evelyn," he said, He stopped, tried again. "There are things I want that I haven't let myself want in a long time. Things I don't know how to say without sounding like a man who's gotten ahead of himself." "You're not ahead of yourself," she said quietly. "You don't know what I was about to say." "No, but I know you." She met his eyes. "And you haven't been ahead of yourself once since I've known you. You've been, if anything, too careful." He was quiet for a moment. The summer heat pressed around them. Somewhere a horse moved on the road, life going on the way it always did. "I'd like to court you properly," he said. "If you'll have it." She felt the words land, felt them in her chest, warm and certain the way true things feel. "Jesse Calloway," she said, "you have been courting me for 8 months through letters. I think we're past the proposal stage." He looked at her for a moment. "Is that a yes?" "That," she said, "is a yes." He didn't sweep her up. He didn't make a dramatic gesture. He reached out with the same deliberate care he brought to everything and took her hand. His hand was rough from the fence posts and warm from the summer, and it held hers like something he intended to keep. They stood on the front steps of the county commissioner's building in Sweetwater Ridge, Georgia, in the high heat of summer, holding hands in plain sight of whoever cared to look. Some people looked. Some of them nodded. One man tipped his hat. Margaret Howell, half a block away, noticed and said nothing, and that was perhaps the greatest victory of the day. That evening, Evelyn sat on her porch as the heat began to break into something more like bearable. Jessie had gone home to write the letter to the railroad agent she had helped him draft it at her kitchen table. The two of them bent over paper and arguing pleasantly about language, and it had been one of the finest hours she could remember. Thomas's pocket watch sat on the windowsill inside. She had decided what to do with it. She would keep it, not put it away, not store it in a drawer. Keep it where she could see it because it was Thomas's, and Thomas had been real and good, and part of her, and that didn't end because her life kept going. She looked at the light in the Calloway house windows, steady and warm. She thought about what she'd told Jessie in Sarah's office weeks ago now. "I'm terrified. I just don't let terrified make my decisions." She thought about the pie tin and the apple filling and the way he had looked at her that first day, like a puzzle he hadn't expected to encounter. She thought about 8 months of letters written in winter and early spring, the words of a lonely man and a lonely woman finding each other in the most ordinary, extraordinary way through paper and honesty and the stubborn human refusal to stop reaching out. She breathed in the cooling evening. She was not done being afraid. She suspected she would be afraid in one way or another for a long time, yet afraid of loving and losing, afraid of what came next, afraid of mornings that might go wrong. That fear was not going away. She had made peace with that. But Jessie's light was on across the field, and she had his letter in her apron pocket, and tomorrow he would be at her door before the coffee cooled. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was, she thought, everything. He was at her door before the coffee cooled. He had been every morning for 2 weeks. It had become the shape of their days. His knock her door, the coffee already poured, because she had learned the rhythm of his footsteps on the porch boards. Small and ordinary and entirely new. She had forgotten that love could live in something as simple as knowing when someone was coming before they arrived. They sat at her kitchen table, and he showed her the railroad agent's response. The man had written back within 4 days, which told her everything about how much the company wanted that south corner. The offer was reasonable. More than reasonable, actually. She read the numbers and kept her expression neutral because Jessie was watching her for a reaction, and she didn't want to give him one before she'd thought it through. "It's a fair price," she said. "It's a good price." "What does Sarah say?" "That I should counter." He looked at the letter. "She said they want the land badly enough that I have room to push. Do you want to push?" He thought about it honestly, the way he did everything. "I want it settled," he said. "I want the south corner sold, the rest of mine, and this finished. I'm tired of legal proceedings." She understood that in her bones. "Then counter once," she said. "A number you can live with. If they take it, done. If they don't, you'll know what they're actually willing to do." He looked at her. "What number?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," she said. "Firm and fair. You're not greedy, and you're not desperate. Make sure they know both things." He nodded slowly. He folded the letter. He looked at her with that expression she had come to know well, the one that meant he was about to say something that cost him something, and was going to say it anyway. "You're good at this," he said. "At what?" "Knowing what's right without needing it dressed up." She smiled and stood to refill the coffee. "Thomas used to say I had the instincts of a judge and the patience of a woman who'd been waiting her whole life to use them." She said it easily, the way she'd been learning to say Thomas's name, not avoiding it, not overweighting it, just letting it be part of the conversation, the way he was part of her woven in. Jessie received it the same way. No flinching, no careful politeness. Just a nod, and, "Sounds like he knew you well." "He did," she said. "He'd have liked you." "You said that before." "I keep meaning it more." He looked at his coffee cup. Something in him settled. She could see it the way a man sets down a burden he's been half expecting to pick back up. The railroad counter came back accepted within the week. Sarah handled the paperwork. The south corner was sold, the funds transferred, the agreement signed and witnessed and done. Jessie Calloway owned the rest of his land clean and clear, no contest, no cloud on the title, no Caroline Winters lurking at the edges. Caroline herself had gone quiet. The disclosure of Dr. Webb's statement to the county authorities had produced a formal inquiry. Not a criminal charge yet, but the machinery of consequence had begun moving, and everyone in Sweetwater Ridge could hear it. Her Atlanta attorney had stopped answering letters. Her visits to town had ceased. Whatever she was doing it somewhere else, and Sweetwater Ridge on the whole seemed relieved by the absence. Evelyn did not feel triumphant about it. She felt tired and clean, the way you feel after a long illness, breaks grateful and slightly hollowed out, relieved to be through it. Jesse felt it differently. She could tell. There was something lighter in him that she hadn't seen before, not careless. Jesse was never careless, but eased, like a man who had been breathing in shallow for 3 years and had finally taken a full breath and found his lungs still worked. He started working the land differently. She noticed it from her porch. Larger sections cleared, the pace of it changed, a man working toward something, instead of just working to hold on. One afternoon she walked over and asked him what he was planning. He showed her. He had sketched it out on paper, rough, practical, no pretension fields expanded, a proper barn, a kitchen garden on the south side of the house where the light was good. The kitchen garden, she said. It needs someone who knows what she's doing. He said it without looking up from the sketch. I can dig and fence. I can't grow a thing worth eating. She studied the sketch. You'd want tomatoes on the east edge, and keep the herbs close to the door. You want them in reach when you're cooking. He looked up then. His pen had stopped moving. I'm making suggestions for your garden, she said steadily. I noticed. That doesn't mean anything beyond the gardening. I know. Good. Evelyn. She looked at him. I've been thinking, he said with the deliberateness of a man who has been thinking for a while and has finally run out of reasons to keep it to himself. About what I said outside the commissioner's building, about courting you properly. I remember. I've been doing it wrong. She blinked. I beg your pardon. Courting properly, I've been treating it like a legal proceeding. Evidence, patience, letting time pass. He set the pen down. That's not wrong, but it's not complete either. He looked at her directly. I want to marry you, Evelyn. Not someday as a vague idea. I mean to ask you plainly as soon as I'm sure you're ready to hear it without running. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a horse moved in the field. I'm not running, she said carefully. No, but you're calculating. She laughed, surprised, genuine. Jesse Calloway, I am always calculating. That is simply my nature. I know. He didn't smile, but his eyes did. Calculate as long as you need. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him. This man who had moved next door to a pen pal, who had carried court documents in a saddlebag for 7 years just in case, who told the truth when lying would have been easier, and held her hand in plain sight of a town that was watching and didn't look away once. Give me a little time, she said. You have it, he said, and picked up his pen and went back to the sketch as if the whole conversation had been as natural as breathing, because for him it had been. She walked home with her thoughts in a state she could only describe as organized chaos. The thing about grief, the real thing, the thing nobody tells you, is that it doesn't leave. It becomes familiar. It becomes over time something you know how to live with, the way you live with a scar present, and not painful in the old way, just part of the landscape of yourself. She sat with Thomas's watch that evening. She held it in her palm and let herself feel the full weight of what she was considering. She owed him that honesty. She owed herself that honesty. She had loved Thomas for 22 years. She would love him the rest of her life in the way that things that shaped you never fully leave you. That was not a betrayal of Jesse. That was not a betrayal of anything. And Jesse. She had been afraid these weeks that what she felt for him was loneliness, wearing love's clothes, that she was mistaking comfort for something deeper. She had examined that fear thoroughly and found it didn't hold. What she felt for Jesse Calloway was not comfort. Comfort was easy and warm, and asked nothing of you. Jesse asked things of her honesty, courage, the willingness to be seen clearly, the willingness to stand in the middle of a difficult thing and not look away. She had done all of that. So had he. She set the watch back on the windowsill. She looked at it for a moment. "I think you'd have liked him," she said. Out loud in the quiet kitchen, feeling slightly foolish and not actually foolish at all. "I think you'd have respected him." The watch ticked. The evening pressed on. She made her decision. But she didn't make him wait long. She had told him she needed a little time, and she was not a woman who padded her words. A little time meant a little time, not a prolonged strategic silence. 4 days later, she baked a pie. Apple same as the first one. She wrapped it carefully this time, both hands, and walked across the field in the summer morning, with the particular calm of a woman who has made a decision and is at peace with it. He was at the fence line. He always was. He saw her coming and straightened, and she watched him look at the pie tin, and something move across his face. Recognition, and then something more careful. Something hoping without letting itself hope too loud. She stopped in front of him. She held out the pie. "This one," she said, "is a yes." He looked at her. He looked at the pie. He looked back at her, and this time the careful stillness cracked open entirely, and what was underneath it was so plain and so unguarded that she felt her own chest tighten with the realness of it. He took the pie with one hand. With the other, he reached out and cupped her face with a roughened palm just briefly, just enough. "Evelyn Carter," he said, "you are the finest thing that has ever knocked on my fence post." She laughed. The laugh came up from somewhere deep and real. "You are aware that technically I knocked on your door." "You knocked on my fence line first. I was paying attention." She covered his hand with hers for a moment. "Take me inside," she said. "I'll cut the pie, and you can tell me what you're planting in the south field." "Already have a list." "Of course you do." He carried the pie to the house, and she walked beside him, and the summer morning pressed down, warm and indifferent and alive around them both. Mike. They told Sarah first, because Sarah had earned it. She received the news with a brief warm smile and the practical question of whether they wanted to handle the property paperwork before or after the ceremony, because as Jesse's wife Evelyn's legal standing relative to the land was a matter worth clarifying up front. Jesse said after. Sarah said before was smarter. Evelyn said she agreed with Sarah, and Jesse conceded gracefully, which Evelyn noted was a good sign for the marriage. They told Reverend Aldous second. He stood in his doorway and looked at them both, and said with more warmth than Evelyn had seen from him in years, "I would be honored." Then he looked at Jesse and said, "You picked a remarkable woman." And Jesse said, "I know it," with such simple certainty that the Reverend actually laughed. Margaret Howell found out the way the rest of Sweetwater Ridge found out through the particular atmosphere of a small town that senses news before it's announced the quality of the air around two people changing in ways that those who've been watching can read. She appeared at Evelyn's door the morning after the Reverend's visit with a length of good fabric under her arm, white fine cotton, the kind used for Sunday clothes. "I've been sewing for 40 years, she said, holding it out. "It would be my honor, if you'd let me." Evelyn looked at the fabric. She looked at Margaret, who was trying not to look like she was hoping too hard. "Come in," Evelyn said. "Let's talk about what I want." What she wanted was simple. She was not a young woman playing at dreams. She was a 38-year-old widow who knew exactly who she was and what fit her and what didn't. She wanted something she could stand in for an hour in July heat and not wilt. She wanted her arms comfortable and her waist her own, and nothing that required her to be other than what she was. Margaret listened and took notes, and did not offer a single opinion that hadn't been asked for. It was, Evelyn thought, the beginning of something genuinely new between them. The wedding was on a Saturday in late August, when the heat had peaked and was just beginning to consider retreating, and the whole of Sweetwater Ridge Baptist Church was full in the way it only ever was for events that mattered. Harold Pruitt was there in the front row, for once sitting up straight with his good hat on. Dr. Webb had written a letter he was too far to travel back, but the letter was in Sarah Chen's pocket, and she had offered to read it aloud after the ceremony if anyone wanted, and most people did. Jesse stood at the front of the church in the best clothes he owned, which were clean and pressed and fit him well enough, and he stood the way he always stood, with the particular stillness of a man who is exactly where he means to be. He did not fidget. He did not look at the door with the nervy energy of bridegrooms who are still half hoping and half terrified. He had decided something, and it was visible in every line of him. Evelyn came through the door, and his face did not change, and everything about him changed. She saw it. She walked toward him, and she saw it, and she was glad there was no one standing between them, because she needed to see his face clearly, and she did. She was wearing Margaret's dress, simple, well-made, exactly what she had asked for. She was herself, full weight and full presence and full heart, and she walked down the aisle of that church in Sweetwater Ridge, Georgia, in the last week of summer, without apologizing for a single inch of herself. Jesse reached out his hand when she was close enough. She took it. Reverend Aldous opened his book. "We are gathered," he said, and the room settled into the particular hush of people who have come to witness something true. They said their vows plainly. No elaborate language, no performance. Jesse's voice was low and steady, and he looked at her the entire time. Not at the Reverend, not at the room, at her. She said her words back to him with the same directness she brought to everything, and she meant every syllable, and he knew it. When it was done, Jesse Calloway held her face in both hands and kissed her with the same deliberate care he brought to all things that mattered to him, and the room responded the way rooms full of people who have been through something together respond, with genuine warmth, not performance, not obligation. Harold started it again. One slow clap. She would have to thank him for that eventually. Afterward, on the church steps, Sarah Chen pressed the railroad agreement papers into Jesse's hand, signed, countersigned, completed, and said, "Congratulations. Your property is fully documented, your south corner is sold, and your wife is listed as co-owner of record as of this morning." She shook his hand, then Evelyn's. "It was my privilege." Jesse looked at the papers in his hand. He looked at Evelyn beside him. He looked out at the town that had watched them fight for this, and had slowly and imperfectly and humanly come around to standing with them. "How's that feel?" Evelyn asked him quietly. "Like something Daniel would have wanted to see," Jesse said. She squeezed his hand. He held on. That evening, they sat on his porch, their porch now, or it would be the arrangements still being worked out between two people who were combining lives with the same practical honesty they brought to everything else. And the summer finally relented, the air cooling toward something almost gentle, and the first stars came out over the Georgia fields. Jesse had the railroad counter-offer letter somewhere inside, and the deed documents, and the list of things to plant in the south field. Evelyn had Thomas's pocket watch in her pocket, brought with her deliberately, because she was not a woman who left important things behind. She took it out and held it a moment in the cooling dark. "I'm going to put it in the house," she said, "on a shelf where I can see it." "Good," Jesse said. He didn't ask why. He understood. She put it back in her pocket and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her with the steadiness of a man who had made a decision about what he was holding on to and wasn't letting go. The field stretched out before them, dark and quiet, and entirely theirs. Somewhere far to the south, a train moved through the night. The railroad that had tried, through Caroline's scheming, to take this land, and had ended up simply buying a corner of it at fair price. The rest standing untouched, as Daniel had wanted, as Jesse had promised, as Evelyn had helped fight for. She thought about the morning she had picked up a pie tin with flour on her hands and grief in her chest, and told herself it was just neighborly, just kindness, just pie. She thought about 8 months of letters written in winter loneliness, and answered with a honesty she had not expected and had never forgotten. She thought about a pie slipping and apple filling going everywhere, and a man's careful voice saying, "Ma'am, you all right?" And the fact that the answer now was the fullest yes she had ever given. Evelyn Carter had buried her husband and survived her grief and stood her ground in a commissioner's hearing and walked down the aisle of a Baptist church in a dress made by a woman who had once said something cruel about her size and then made it right, and she had done all of it without shrinking herself to fit what other people thought she should be. She had done it as herself every pound, every year, every scar and surviving piece of her, and it had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything. Jessie Calloway pressed a kiss to the top of her head and said nothing because nothing needed saying. Because some things are true without being spoken, because that is the nature of the